Hey all, this is Professor Tracy from Law Simply Explained with an introductory lesson to contracts. So our starting place here is to talk about a promise. And you might say, well, why is that? Because when we look at the legal definition of a contract, we're told that a contract is a promise or a set of promises, and we'll dive into the latter half of the definition in just a minute, but it tells us that it's a promise or a set of promises for which the law recognizes either a duty or it recognizes that a breach, meaning the failure to fulfill that promise, should be given some sort of legal remedy. And so our starting place when we think of contracts and the law of contracts is to ask ourselves, what is a promise? Because that's the building block of a contract. And so when we think about a promise, we need to get some terminology out of the way. And to do that, we're going to have Bob and Barb help us out here. So if Bob says, Barb, I will take you to Disney World over winter break, then we know that that's a promise, right? Just like in everyday speech, when we tell somebody, I will do X, Y, and Z, that's a promise. It's a commitment to do something. And here, Bob is saying, I will take you, Barb, to Disney World over winter break. And so that's no different under the law. We're going to break it down in a little more detail in a second, but it's still a promise. And because we're not very inventful in the law or very creative, we say that the person making the promise is the promisor, and the person to whom that promise is made is the promisee. And we then need to say, well, what is the legal definition of a promise? And we're told that a promise is a manifestation of an intention to act or refrain from acting in a specified way, so made as to justify a promisee and understanding a commitment has been made. That's a lot going on there, right? And unlike a class like criminal law or torts, which is kind of necessarily and broken down into elements, we need to break this down ourselves. So we need to chunk it and break it up into elements. And so we can say, well, what's the first element? The promise it's a manifestation of an intention. And intention to do what? To act or refrain from acting in a specified way. And it means that it's so made as to justify a promisee, remember that's the person to whom the promise is made, in understanding that a commitment has been made. So let's look at each of those elements. So the first one is it's a manifestation of an intention. So what do we mean by that? Well, here, if Bob is just thinking, I will take Barb to Disney World over winter break, that's something that's just in his head. It's a thought that he's having. It's not a manifestation. When we use the word manifestation, we mean something that is outwardly expressed, not something that's just kept in my head, but something I have vocalized or written, but somehow outwardly expressed to someone else. And so here, if Bob is saying nothing, but just thinking in his head, then we don't have a manifestation. And when we say an intention, we mean that the person is manifesting that they'll do something in particular. So if Bob says, Barb, I will take you to Disney World over winter break, he is now speaking outwardly, expressing outwardly through spoken word that he will do something, right? He has an intention to do a particular thing. Here, that is that he will take Barb to Disney World over break. So that is, in fact, a promise because he has a manifestation of intention, and the other elements will be met as well, and we'll look at those in just a second. So it's an intention to do what? To act or refrain from acting in a specified way. So if Bob says, I promise you that Disney World won't be too crowded. Well, that is not a promise by Bob to act or refrain from acting in a specified way, right? When Bob says, I promise you that Disney World won't be too crowded, that is not Bob committing to do a particular thing or not to do a particular thing. That's him promising something over which he really doesn't have any control at all. He's just saying, I promise it won't be too crowded, but that's not an intention to do something or not do something in particular. So it may not even satisfy element one. It's certainly a manifestation of spoken word, but it's not really an intention to act or refrain from acting in a specified way. But if Bob says, I won't eat the chili this time, then that is Bob is speaking not only an outward manifestation to act, but to also to act or not act in a specified way. Here, it's to not eat the chili. So now we have, again, a promise, right? Because we can say that he is outwardly manifesting an intention to act or refrain from acting in a specified way. So that those elements are satisfied. And we have the third element, where the promise must be so made as to justify a promisee. Remember, that's the person to whom the promise is made, in understanding that a commitment has been made. So here, one of the important things to know about this element as we look at it, and Bob is saying, I hope we can do the Haunted Mansion ride. We can look at this and go, well, it is an outward manifestation, but it's not of an intention to act or not act in a perfect way, in a particular way. He's not making a commitment, right? He's using the word, I hope this is something we can do. He's not saying we will do this, or I promise that we will ride the Haunted Mansion ride. He's not doing that. So here, that the third element wouldn't be satisfied. But the thing to understand about this third element of so made as to justify a promisee and understanding that a commitment has been made is that we're asking, how would a reasonable person in the shoes of the promisee, here Barb, would they understand this expression from Bob? Would they understand that a commitment has been made? And here the answer is no, because of the word that he's using. In just a second, we'll say, well, how exactly do we determine that? So the thing to know just right here is we're not looking at what Bob in his head thinks that he's saying, right? That would be subjective. But we would say, how would this be received by the promisee, a reasonable person in the shoes of the promisee? And here we can fairly say that using the word hope means he's not committing to do a particular thing. So if, though, Bob says something like this, I swear that we will not dress up as Mickey and Minnie this time. Now he's using a word here that is not just I hope, right? Some sort of up in the air word, but the reasonable person in the shoes of the promisee, Barb, would think, oh, based on the word that he's used, that he's committing here to not do something in particular, which is we will not dress up as Mickey and Minnie this time. So he's made a commitment here that this is something that they will not do. So that third element would be satisfied. But the question that we've been touching on is, well, how exactly do we know that? About what Bob is intending, about whether he's intending to make a commitment or not. And there are three sort of basic tools that we use when we are trying to decide whether or not a reasonable person in the shoes of the promisee would interpret Bob's manifestation as a commitment. Whether we can look at it and say, yes, he has made a manifestation of an intent to act or not act in a specified way. And these are tools that we will use, interpretive tools that we'll come back to later as we progress through this material regarding contracts. But here in this introductory lesson, it's important to at least lay some general groundwork and say that when we are trying to decide whether somebody like Bob, the promisor, is intending to make a commitment and how that should be understood, then we need to use some basic tools of an interpretation to determine what his intent is. And so we'll start by saying we're going to give his words their ordinary meaning. And so when we look at him saying something like, I swear that we will not dress up as Mickey and Minnie this time, we would look at the word swear and say, well, what's the ordinary meaning of that? Which means to promise you will do something or behave in a particular way. That's the ordinary meaning of I swear that this is what we will do or won't do. And so we would say, well, the ordinary meaning leads us to believe that he is making a commitment here when he says, I swear we will not dress up as Mickey and Minnie this time. And if there's a technical word, that we give it its technical meaning. So for instance, if Bob says to Barb, I guarantee we will have an extra magic hour each day, then the word extra magic hour is a term of art, that it has a technical meaning. Just giving those words their ordinary meaning, if we go to the dictionary, is not going to help us. That's not going to tell us what is meant here by Bob. So we need to look and say, well, what does that mean in this particular context of going to a Disney resort and staying there and going to a park like the Magic Kingdom? What does that mean? Well, what it means is that if you stay at the resort, you get an hour either before or after the close of park as a benefit of staying at the resort. You get this extra time where presumably it's a little less crowded and you get to enjoy Disney World in a context, at least for a little while, where there's a few less people around. So if we give it its technical meaning, we can understand what he's saying there, that yes, he's intending to make a commitment that we're going to stay somewhere that's going to allow us to have this extra hour each day. So again, he would be making a promise. We know that because here we would give the words their ordinary meaning, but if there's a technical term like magic hour, extra magic hour, then we would use the technical meaning for that phrase. The other thing to know is sometimes we need to look at all the surrounding circumstances in order to understand what somebody intends. So if we're trying to interpret something objectively, then we need to account not only for the ordinary meaning of words used in their ordinary sense and the technical meaning of words used in their technical sense, but also look at all the surrounding circumstances to understand what was meant here by the promisor. And so if we have a situation where Bob says, oh, don't you worry, Barb, we will put the magic in Magic Kingdom, if you know what I mean. Well, giving those words their ordinary meaning doesn't really help us, right? And it's not really a technical word, but we can look at this and say, well, if we know all the surrounding circumstance, that they're going away on this trip, that they're a couple, then we can look and go, oh, what Bob is promising there is a romantic time with Barb. And so we can say, yes, he is committing to have a romantic time with his partner Barb. So we can understand that because we can look at all the surrounding circumstances. So if we, just to back up a second, then we can look back and say, in order for us to interpret and to understand whether or not somebody in the shoes of the promisee should understand the promisor as having made a commitment, we would need to say, well, how do we understand the ordinary meaning of the words used in their ordinary sense, the technical meaning of the words used in their technical sense, and all the surrounding circumstances? And only then can we answer that question of was there a commitment made? Is that last element of the promise met? Well, now let's look at the method of making a promise. How may a promise be made? And here we have again a definition or a rule that says a promise may be stated in words, either spoken or written, or may be inferred wholly or partly from conduct. Again, we want to chunk something up into its elements when we have a definition like that. So we can say, one, that a promise can be what? It can be either spoken, or two, written, or it may be inferred from conduct. So let's look at each of those in turn with these three methods. We said there could be spoken words, there could be written words, or we can infer, it can be inferred from conduct. So looking at spoken words, if Bob says to Barb, I promise to take you to Disney World over winter break, that's spoken word, right? That's one method of making a promise. He is verbally or orally making his promise. So that would work, assuming all the elements of a promise are met that we've covered. Then it could be written words. Bob could say, Dearest Barb, I promise to take you to Disney World over winter break. Love, always, Bob. So it's just written word. That works just as well for him to make a promise to Barb. Then it could be inferred from conduct. And in this situation, that's a little tricky. So if Bob puts on his mouse ears here, that could be him, depending on the surrounding circumstance, that could be interpreted perhaps as him making some sort of promise. But the normal kind of scenario you would think of here would be situations where the conduct can clearly be understood as making some sort of commitment. So for instance, if you're at a bar, a noisy bar, and having drinks with somebody, and you raise your hand to get the bartender's attention and gesture something like two, bring me two, right? Just sit up, stick your hand up with two fingers. That would be a way of communicating to the bartender that I would like you to bring another round of drinks for us, and I am committing implicitly by my conduct to pay for those drinks. And so if the bartender may just nod saying, yes, I see you, I'll send over the drinks. And that would be a set of promises implied by conduct, inferred by the conduct. Here, putting on the mouse ears may not be enough. You would need at least some other surrounding circumstance. Perhaps if he had packed the car up and pulled the car up and ready to go, and then he slapped on his mouse ears, then all of that together might be enough to say, yes, he is committing at that moment to take Barb on a romantic trip to Disney World over winter break. So how do we determine, though, whether a promise is legally enforceable? Because remember, the first part of what we were looking at was just what is a promise, looking at the anatomy of a promise. But we said when we looked at our definition of a promise that not only is a contract a promise or a set of promises, but it's a set of promises for which either the law is going to provide a remedy or it's recognizing some sort of legal duty, meaning that people make promises all the time, but not every promise is legally enforceable. Just because, for instance, you promise you're going to take somebody to dinner and invite them over your house and you don't, doesn't mean that person can run into court and sue you to say, well, Tracy said he would take me out to dinner and he didn't do it, or he would have me over his house to play board games and he never did. That not every promise creates a legal duty or is something for which the law says if Tracy doesn't invite you over for dinner or doesn't invite you over for board games, that the law is going to recognize some sort of remedy for that, that you're going to get money damages or some sort of order that Tracy must have you over. Those kinds of things, which would be a remedy. So not every promise is legally enforceable, and that makes good sense. But certainly some promises need to be legally enforceable, particularly, for instance, in a commercial context or a business context. So how do we know whether something's legally enforceable? And the key issue here of knowing whether the law is going to recognize a duty or recognize a remedy, and often both, is that we need to know, is the promise contractual or gratuitous? Contractual or gratuitous. So what do we mean by a contractual promise? Well, contractual promises are those that are legally enforceable. So now we're doing some sorting, right? Where we're saying contractual promises are legally enforceable, but gratuitous are not. So just like we established that, well, of course, not every promise should allow somebody to run into court and sue to enforce it, because otherwise the courts would be ridiculously overrun with people suing, and B, that would create a very litigious society that we don't want, and people make commitments all the time for which we do not allow them to run into court to enforce it, to get a remedy, etc. But we need to know, how do we decide which ones the law should recognize a remedy, should say there is a legal duty, not just a moral duty to follow through in what you commit, but an actual legal duty, so it's legally enforceable. And the way we do that sorting is to say, well, those promises that are contractual are legally enforceable. Those that are merely gratuitous, as a general rule, are not legally enforceable. I have an asterisk there because there are often other ways that a gratuitous promise could be legally enforceable, and we'll look at those as we progress through all the contracts material. So what do we mean by a contractual promise? And this is something for which we are going to say a whole lot more, but just as an introductory matter, it's a situation where the promise is part of an exchange, that the promise is made in return for something else, usually a return promise or a return performance. And it's okay if that doesn't make total sense right now. It will moving forward. So let's look at a quick example here with Bob and Barb. If Bob says to Barb, if you earn an A in contracts, I will take you to Disney World over winter break. He's now not only making a commitment, right? I will take you to Disney World over winter break. He's actually looking for an exchange, something in return. So Barb says, sounds good. I will earn an A in contracts this semester. So Barb is making a return promise, a return commitment. So we have an exchange of promise, right? A promises. It's a set of promises. So when Bob is making his promise, he's getting a promise in return from Barb. And that return promise, we'll see, is known as consideration. You don't need to fully understand that now, but it will make sense down the road. But the thing to know is that a contractual promise is a promise for which there is either a return promise made, as here from Barb, or a return performance is given. And we'll explain exactly what that means in more detail later. But for now, it's enough to say it's part of an exchange. And so this promise for a promise, this return promise, is known as consideration in this context. And so it's part of a contract, right? Because we said that a contract is a set of promises. And we've been unpacking this over and over in this definition. So it's probably self-evident to call a promise contractual, that it's got to be part of a contract. And so it's got to fall within these three things, right? That the promise or set of promises is one for which the law recognizes a duty to perform, as we've been saying, and it gives a remedy for breach. And we'll say much more about that. But the key thing to recognize is it's part of an exchange, right? An agreement, like we looked at with Bob and Barb. That Bob is saying, I will take you to Disney World over winter break if you get an A. And Barb is agreeing, yes, I promise I will earn an A in contracts this semester. So they've come to an agreement. So we would say that Bob's promise is contractual in nature. But a gratuitous promise, we said, is not legally enforceable. Because why? It's not part of an exchange. It's what we call a naked or gratuitous promise. And so when Bob says, I promise to take you to Disney World over winter break, then he's made a promise, and we've said that sort of over and over again. But if that's all that's going on and Barb is silent, and recognize Bob didn't say in this case, if you earn an A, he's not looking for anything in return. And Barb is not, there is nothing coming in return. Then here we would say that is just a gratuitous promise. It's not part of an exchange of promises or a promise for performance. So it's merely gratuitous or a naked or a nude promise that we would say, as a general rule, is not legally enforceable. So a promise for a gift, whether that's a gift trip, like this one in the example, a gift trip to Disney World, or anything, right? I promise to give you a bicycle, I promise to give you a book, whatever it may be, that promise is, if it's just for a gift, it's made without any expectation of receiving anything in return, and as a general rule is not legally enforceable. So to set the stage here at the beginning, I want to give you a quick look at an analytic framework which will organize all of the material in contracts under this subject of contracts. So this contracts analytic framework we can look at and say all the way on the left is where we are now, that we are under this heading of formation, so contract formation. How do we form a contract? What are the rules governing the formation of a contract? And then we'll look at defenses to formation, that things that may come up either during the formation of the contract or right after the formation of a contract, that would either excuse the performance of the parties or prevent the formation of the contract. We'll look at issues of interpretation and implied terms. We'll look at breach of the contract and related issues dealing with conditions and repudiation, and then remedies, which often is money but could be other things. So our focus on the first part, though, is formation, and in particular, we're touching on this idea of consideration. We've laid the building, sort of the foundation here, the basic building block of a contract, looked at what a promise is, and tried to distinguish between promises that the law recognizes as legally enforceable, which are promises that are contractual in nature, promises for which there is consideration given, meaning a return promise or return performance, and those promises that are not, as a general matter, legally enforceable because they're gratuitous or naked promises. So I hope that's helpful to you as you're working your way through contract law, thinking about these concepts. Obviously, there's a lot more to delve into. If this video was helpful to you, I'd appreciate it if you would like and subscribe. So I will check in with you soon with another video. Thanks. Bye.